Hello everyone. Before we get started with sermon notes, some of you were asking, where did I do this hike up a mountain for the video on Sunday? That was in Belcarra Regional Park. And so we started, my son and I, Bennett, who's 21, it's his birthday on Saturday. And so we wanted to do a hike together, spend some quality time as father and son. We parked at White Pine Beach and we hiked along Sassamat Lake, beautiful there, through the woods to Woodhaven Swamp. Spent some time looking at that huge swamp there. It's amazing. What a diverse area this is in God's creation. Through some hemlock forests, huge hemlocks, switchbacking back down the hill, mountains, to the beach, to the ocean, Belcarra Pier there. Had a bit of a rest and then all the way back. Now, my son is very fit, and so he could have done it much quicker, but it took us 4 hours. I was in pain, agony, because I'm not as fit as my 21-year-old, and so it took us a long time. I'm a little slow. Welcome everyone to Sermon Notes. This week we're looking at Matthew chapter 17. We're looking at the story of Jesus being transfigured before his disciples Peter, James, and John on a mountaintop. We're going to do two things with Sermon Notes today. First of all, we're going to look at the connection with the Mount of Transfiguration and Mount Sinai and just draw a few more parallels with what's going on there in that connection. And then secondly, we're going to look at the words that the Father says to the Son when he speaks from the cloud and says, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." So those two things. Let's start first then with this connection between two mountains. Well, the first mountain in Exodus is Mount Sinai. And you remember in that Old Testament scene on Sinai that at the top of that mountain went Moses. And he was the leader of the people of Israel here at the bottom of the mountain. And you remember that God showed up in glory, and it was a manifestation of God that appeared in a cloud. A cloud, and out of this cloud was fire, great bright light, and this idea of the glory of God evident in this cloud. Well, the people who saw this, they were afraid. And they said, "Moses, you go up and talk to God. But we're afraid down here." And the holiness is that separation then. The holiness and unholiness is that sense of fear. Well, the Father speaks to Moses from the cloud. And so Moses in that way is affirmed. He's affirmed in this that Moses is the one that God is establishing as the leader of his people. And that what God is saying to Moses is the words of God for his people, Israel. Well, now we fast forward to our mountain today that we're looking at in Matthew chapter 17, and that's in the New Testament, Matthew 17, and that's the mountain of transfiguration, and at the top of this mountain is the Son, Jesus. And at the top of this mountain are the Israelites. They're not at the bottom here, but they have the same reaction, don't they? They have that same reaction of fear when at the top of the mountain comes this cloud. The same cloud that is described in Matthew 17 as having glory within it. Let's read it specifically. Verse 5 of chapter 17, "But even as he spoke," this is Peter speaking, "a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my beloved Son.'" We're going to look at that in a moment. Well, we can see what a parallel this is. Let me point out a few things going on. This cloud was eventually called the Shekinah glory of God. Shekinah being a Hebrew word that specifically means the visible glory of God. And there are times, aren't there, when God is manifest, making it obvious, demonstrating, making it clear who he is, albeit still veiled in his completeness, but lifting up the veil in order for those who are seeing this to receive a manifestation of his glory. That Shekinah glory of God appears on the mountaintop. It also appears later in the tabernacle down here with the people. It also appears in the temple. I won't draw that, I'm running out of room. In the temple in 1 Kings, we see that same glory cloud going into the temple place, into the sanctuary. We also see this cloud in Ezekiel's revelation that he has, his vision that he has. That's Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 4. Well, this Shekinah glory of God is present here in Sinai. And out of that Shekinah glory of God, the Father is now speaking to the Son. And so when we see the Father speaking to the Son here, he is saying, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." And there is that same sense of affirmation that Jesus is the one that the Father is calling and is establishing. He's affirming Jesus as the leader of his people. And in fact, the leader of all people, the kingdom of heaven. Well, let's look now at what the Father is saying from the cloud. As we're looking at the Father speaking to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration and saying that this is his Son, his beloved Son, in whom he's well pleased, listen to him. We might remember back to Matthew chapter 3 and make a connection there with Matthew 3. In that moment, it's Jesus' baptism. Do you remember that in Jesus' baptism in Matthew chapter 3, the Father speaks from the heavens? And what he says is that Jesus is his Son in whom he's well pleased. Well, we should really pay attention to this. The Father does not do this very often, speaking from the clouds. But in Matthew chapter 3, when he does this, he is establishing Jesus as the Messiah. And he is affirming Jesus' role to build the kingdom of heaven. That's very important. Jesus is the one that the kingdom of heaven will be built through because he is his Son. He is the Messiah. And so the Father is affirming Jesus' vocation. He is affirming Jesus' mission. He is affirming the work of Jesus. So we've seen on Mount Transfiguration an affirmation of Jesus' nature, and we are seeing in the words that the Father is speaking an affirmation of Jesus' work. His work as Messiah to establish the kingdom of heaven. And then we see in Matthew chapter 3 up to chapter 16 that Jesus is establishing the kingdom of heaven. He's defeating the enemies of Israel. He is calling the people back from exile. He is the one that is delivering the truth of God and obedience, what it means to be obedient and to follow him. And in that way, he is restoring the worship of Yahweh among his people. Well, the work of Jesus up to chapter 16 is focused around this. But in chapter 16, you remember, I'll just put this here, chapter 16 is that swing passage where we now see Jesus moving towards Jerusalem and towards the cross. In chapter 16, he is going to complete his work in the future as he goes towards the cross and the empty tomb. He's just said that in chapter 16, and now chapter 17, we see again another affirmation of this calling. Matthew 17, and here we see the transfiguration. I ran out of room, so transfigure is close enough. Well, what an incredible connection then when Jesus is being spoken to by the Father, an affirmation of his work that he will do to establish the kingdom, and an affirmation of his work that he will do to complete that kingdom of heaven work on the cross and the empty tomb. In both cases, these are affirmed by a supernatural moment of the Father speaking from the heavens, saying almost the same thing. This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. Let's look at this first phrase that the Father speaks This is my beloved Son. Let's write this out. You can write this out on a piece of paper and try to make some connections to what's going on here. This is my beloved Son. Well, when the Father is speaking that this is his beloved Son, we can see, first of all, that this word beloved is important. It's important because we see over and over again the nature of the Trinity in the New Testament. And the nature of the Trinity is one where there is a bond of love between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This great bond of love is being expressed in this phrase, "This is my beloved Son." We can see this in the book of John. We see it elsewhere in Matthew as well, where Jesus makes that connection that the Father loves him and that he loves the Father. So he is the beloved Son. And when we see this phrase, Son, beloved Son, there's so much about the nature of Jesus that is coming out of this phrase, Son. First of all, we see that the nature of Jesus is such that all the fullness of God dwells in him. I'm going to write that down. You can too. The fullness of God dwells in Jesus. Where do I get that from? It's from Colossians, isn't it? Chapter 2. Let's look at that together and flip over in your Bibles to Colossians chapter 2. It's so important for us to get this verse from Paul. And in Colossians chapter 2, looking at verse 9, Paul says this about Jesus, about his nature. He says, "For in Christ lives all the fullness of God in a human body." Isn't that great? All the fullness of God in a human body. Draw the mountaintop again here and show Jesus in his moment of transfiguration. There is the evidence. There is the manifestation, making something plain and visible to be seen, that all the fullness of God dwells in Jesus Christ. Well, Paul is one to write about that. He himself saw the fullness of God dwelling in Jesus in that moment on the road to Damascus. Well, we also know from, let me write this one down, Colossians 2:9. We also know from Colossians, let's flip a page over to Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. You're familiar with this beautiful passage in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20. Let's look at verse 15 and 16. In verse 15, Paul writes, "Christ is the visible image of the invisible God." Isn't that beautiful? That's what's going on in Transfiguration, isn't it? He's the visible image in that moment of the invisible God. If you like, you can see this cloud as something that is more of the invisible nature of God. Yes, it's a manifestation, and so there is something extraordinarily visible about that. But when Jesus, as in a person, in the form of a person, who has been incarnated, God himself, who has taken on the form of man, in that moment, all the fullness of the invisible reality of God is made visible in Jesus. Well, secondly, we also see that Jesus being the Son does not mean that Jesus is someone that God looked around the earth for and searched and finally found somebody that he could call to be his son. Rather, what we see is that the Son has always existed, and he has always existed as the Son, and he will always exist. So he has pre-existed, and he will exist forever as the Son. Well, we know this from what we're reading here in Colossians, "For through him," verse 16, "God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth." He created things we can see and the things we can't see. Everything was created through him and for him. Look at verse 17. He existed before anything else, and he holds all things together. So, the Son existed before this mountaintop experience, before all things. We also know this from John chapter 1, don't we? In the beginning was the Word, And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So on Mount Sinai, when Moses is speaking with God, Jesus is present in that moment, speaking to Moses. He has always existed, and he always will. So we're learning a lot from this phrase, "This is my beloved Son." So the Son is the one that the Father loves. And now the second phrase, the Father says that he is well pleased with his Son. He is saying that the Son brings him great joy. Yeah. In whom, this is how I've learned it, in whom I am well pleased. What is the Father pleased with? First of all, the nature of Jesus. We just saw that in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, that he is filled with joy, that he is in fact pleased to have all the fullness of God dwell in him. So he's pleased with the nature of Jesus, that nature being all the fullness. Read Colossians again to pick up that joy that the Father has to have all the fullness dwell in Jesus. Secondly, in his work. He's pleased with the work that Jesus has been doing. What work? This kingdom of heaven work he has been establishing up to chapter 16 and continues to establish. But we know from what's been going on up to those chapters that the Father is saying he's pleased with how the Messiah is working the kingdom of heaven in his time, and then secondly with his resisting of the enemy to in fact say yes to the cross. Sorry, I stumbled there just for a moment as I was looking down. Let me draw you back in. He's saying yes to the cross. What is the Father pleased about with the Son? His nature, all the fullness of deity, his work, the kingdom of heaven work. And now in chapter 16, he is saying yes to the cross. And the Father is pleased with this mission work that Jesus has to, in fact, bring redemption to the world. So Jesus is the beloved Son. That's the first thing that the Father speaks from the cloud. Secondly, that he is well pleased with the Son. And now, thirdly, the Father says, listen to him. What an amazing phrase this is, listen to him. First of all, this is a connection back to the Old Testament, and it is a fulfillment of a prophecy. So it's a very important fulfillment of a prophecy, and that prophecy was given by Moses. So what an important thing to connect to, with Moses being there on Mount Transfiguration and saying that this is his beloved Son in whom he's well pleased. Listen to him. That connects us back to a prophecy made by Moses in chapter 18 of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. I'll write that down. Deut 15, verses 18 and 19. I'm sorry, it's chapter 18. Chapter 18, verses 15 to 19. But let's look at verse 15. Listen to this. Deuteronomy, chapter 18, verse 15. Moses continued. Here's the prophecy. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. Fantastic. For this is what you yourselves requested of the Lord your God when you were assembled at Mount Sinai. You said, don't let us hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore, or see this blazing fire, for we will die. Then the Lord said to me, what they have said is right. I will raise up a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell the people everything I command him. I will personally deal with anyone who will not listen to the messages the prophet proclaims on my behalf. Fantastic prophecy. A prophecy looking forward to the Messiah, promising that God himself will put his words within this great prophet. So, when the Father speaks out of the cloud to say, listen to him. It's a fulfillment of that Old Testament prophecy. Secondly, when the Father says, listen to him, he is, of course, establishing in the Father is establishing in the Son that this very hard teaching, and that's the teaching of the cross, that hard teaching is something that is true. It should be listened to. Yes, it's hard, Peter, to hear this, but come up onto the Mount Transfiguration and hear from the Father himself, from the clouds, that this is something that is true. We should listen to him. It's all about the cross. Well, I trust that today, as we've looked at the connection between these mountains, the manifestations from the Old Testament, and now as we've looked at the words that the Father speaks from the clouds, that it encourages you in your faith today. God bless you.